So we're here to launch. This is the official launch day.
Today is the publication.
Of The End of Woke, how the culture war went too far and what to expect from the counter-revolution. So it's an incredibly comprehensive book. I was reading a PDF version. I hadn't realised how big it was until I started scanning through. And 100 pages of that are footnotes. The old academic in you hasn't died off. And
it's very obsessive.
Yes.
And I don't like the idea of people denying the stuff that I'm talking about.
Yeah, okay.
Because they do. They say it's not really happening.
So now we're going to just hammer them overhead.
Yeah, exactly,
yeah. Well, it's it looks great, and it is a really, really excellent read. I'm sure people have had it arriving on your doorsteps, maybe tomorrow morning. And some of you will have heard Andrew talking in various podcasts over the last week or so. So we're going to try and cover some slightly different areas, perhaps, than he's been asked about so far, and there's going to be lots of time for audience questions. So in the title, it's clear that, first of all, the kind of question is there, what makes you confident that woke is moving to an end? Secondly, how do we understand the past 10 or 15 years of woke and what it was? And then thirdly, what will come next, which is really the main argument of the book. The book is an intervention rather than just an analysis, I think. And it's an argument for the need to resurrect a liberal view, perspective on the world and a kind of liberal politics at a time when I think you're suggesting that we're at risk of having a kind of counter-revolution against woke that will be illiberal in nature and that we might as well have stuck with woke. So let's start with the second question about how you understand what woke was, or still is. Let's not assume it's completely gone, because it obviously hasn't, and yes. Some people will argue that it's going to take a lot of bludgeoning over the head to get rid of. But you've been in the States over the last year. What's your kind of perspective on what woke has been?
Well, firstly, I want to thank Jan and Toby and the Free Speech Union, not just for tonight, but for existing, because I think it's been one of the most important developments in recent years. And I think you've been representing and defending over 3,500 people since your inception, which is absolutely incredible. And if you consider the rage of activists when Toby announced this thing, saying it wasn't necessary, this was just right-wing nonsense, etc. And of course, it's non-partisan, it's represented all sorts of people. So I'm really grateful, and I think everyone should be really grateful for its existence. But yeah, so the question, what was woke? I mean, that's something I'm trying to grapple with in this. I mean, in the last book, I was trying to dissect where it came from, what the origins are, and how did it become so prevalent and so powerful in such a relatively short period of time. And in this book, I am really sort of going back and looking at what is it that we live through. I think there's a sense in which many of us are, those of us who have been paying attention will perceive a lot of the things that have been happening as just a kind of moment of hysteria. And I think generally speaking, a lot of people can't see it that way because they're caught in the eye of the storm. I think this whole period, and this is why it's so footnoted, I think in about 50, 60, 70 years' time, historians are going to be baffled by how this occurred, and they're going to be picking over and raking over. How on earth were the leading figures, the leading minds of the time, stating obvious untruths and bullying people into going along with it? How did that occur? I mean, and like you say, it's not gone away. We still have the remnants. This week, we had Lady Hale saying that she's been speaking to some doctors who've told her that biological sex doesn't exist. So, and that's the former president of the Supreme Court. But that's not atypical in the woke movement. And if you look at some of the stuff that leading academics are saying, lawyers, media representatives, doctors, politicians, all of these key figures. One of the things I mentioned at the start of the book is that the studies show that only, by the More in Common initiative, have shown that only roughly 8% of the population of the US and the UK have ever supported woke, even at its height, which means it was always a top-down thing. So we shouldn't be that surprised that the elites started parroting utter nonsense. And yet they did. And now in the last book, I compared it to Salem. And the reason I did that is I felt that the Salem hysteria, which emerged late 17th century, died off within 14 months, and subsequently everyone involved said that they got it wrong and admitted it. But the reason why it was perpetuated and why all those people lost their lives is because the figures of authority were the ones who were saying this is real. So it was the judges, it was the ministers, it was the priests, it was the elders of the village. The girls themselves, if they'd have just been ignored or said, you know, you can cry witch, but it's not real, it would have gone away instantly. The woke movement has a similar kind of feel about it insofar as the activists, the bratish, kind of screeching harpies of the internet have been taken seriously and by those who should know better. And so I don't use the word hysteria lightly. The fact that we have debates in Parliament with elected MPs standing up there defending a policy they can't even define in the form of gender identity. I mean, they can't define it. Jackie Smith was asked, what is the government's working definition of this in the House of Lords? And she blamed the questioner for asking the question. Whereas what she should do as an adult is reflect, oh, well, if we're implementing policy on the basis of something we can't define, maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe, just a suggestion. So I think what we perceive to be the insanity of woke, I really want to get to the nub of your question, which is, what was it? What was it? Well, we know what it was. I mean, in the book, I define it in one sentence. I say that woke is a cultural revolution that seeks equity according to group identity through authoritarian means. And I suppose one of the key arguments I'm trying to say, this is a identitarian monomania, not the first in history, and it won't be the last. But what it is, it's the latest manifestation of authoritarianism, which I see, and I'm sure most of us see, as recurring throughout history, periodically in various guises. And this is just the latest form. What was quite unique about woke is that it was an authoritarian movement that painted itself as being the underdog and being the victim. That's quite different from previous tyrannies, where, you know, the tyrant wouldn't claim to be the victim, he'd just sort of tell you what to do, and that would be the end of it. This is something kind of new. But it's still that authoritarian impulse manifesting in one form or another. That's what I think woke was, and I think we have to keep in mind that idea of group identity, which is why you can trace it to the Marxian influence, to the cultural turn, when the leftist thinkers substituted class and economy and money for group identity. And it just became a kind of treating group identity as though it was something sacred, and all of society could be interpreted adequately through that lens, which I don't think it can be, but that's the way that they did it. So, yeah, I think that, in short, that's what it's quite complicated. But
well, except that the thing that's really clear in the book is the authoritarian element of that kind of composite of the identitarianism plus some kind of sort of shaking up of social relations that's kind of, well, we can talk a bit more about the backdrop to how it was able to take hold. But it's the authoritarianism that really is key, I think, to the argument in this, but it comes through really clearly. Because I think a lot of people might have characterised woke as being like, well, this is a kind of last dying remnants of the left, or this is the logical and very frightening survival of the revolutionary left. That's what the right might say. Other people would say, no, it's a complete departure from the left. But I think once you kind of put the authoritarian lens through it, you see it slightly differently, and it becomes a bit more to be seen as a tool.
Well, that's also why it lasted. That's also why it took hold, because woke activists, on the whole, are quite frightening people. I don't know if you've ever been stuck with one in a lift. They're really scary people. I mean, they look scary, you know, with their sort of strange, flamboyant hair and deadness behind the eyes. Have you seen that sort of? So there's that to deal with. So they are psychopaths. I say that with love, but they really are vicious. I mean, so now I do believe that there are some elements of the woke movement who do genuinely believe that what they are doing is good, and that what they're doing is compassion. But for most of the activists, it's a means to cloak yourself in the garb of virtue and to exert terrible cruelty and ferocity on other people. Of course, sociopaths are going to be attracted to something that gives them power in this way. And we've seen that again and again. If any of you have ever been dogpiled online by the woke, it's incredibly severe. And they will stop at nothing. They will lie, they will defame, they will fabricate whatever they want to get to their end goal. I mean, we've seen the way they revise history. They want to tear down statues. They will tell you that things didn't really happen the way that they did happen. They even tore down the statue of Thomas Henry Huxley, a slavery abolitionist, for goodness sake. You know, they don't really care about what is real and what is not. Truth is just a narrative to them, a competing narrative in order to achieve their goals. That does seem unfair, doesn't it? I think there are some nice woke people, but on the whole...
What is the end goal then? What was the end goal?
But that's it. It wasn't really thought through. It wasn't like there's a utopia here. I think they imagined, or a lot of them have expressed, I mean, well, let's take the Welsh government a few months ago said they were going to eradicate racism by 2028. So that's one example. They did. I mean, they have said that that's their goal. It's not going to happen. The reason I take the liberal approach is that liberals always accept the imperfectibility of humankind. They accept that we are flawed. I start the book with a quotation from E.M. Forster, who talks about the need for tolerance. He talks about how there's the Nazi way of doing things, which is trample on your enemy and get rid of them, or there's the tolerant approach. He says, don't try to love everyone. You can't. But we can tolerate each other. I mean, tolerance is a great idea because it means you don't even have to approve, but it's a recognition that we live in a plural world, that people think about the world differently. And it's messy and it's harder. It's harder than the authoritarian route. And I think one of my main concerns about what happened in woke is it was a kind of escalation of this Manichaean, Disneyfied, let's just reduce the world to good versus evil, to a Disney film, it's infantile. That's what I think it is. And that's why I talk so much in the book about education, because I think it's evidence of a kind of broad, generalized infantilism writ large. I think that's what it is.
So, yes, and I think one of the ways I understand it is that it was a kind of way of making the world smaller for people. So to give people the benefit of the doubt. So you talk about, people with good intentions. And I don't often think that's the case with some of having, witnessed the behaviour of some of the activists. It clearly is not well-intentioned. It's absolutely vile and violent, actually. But I can understand that in a time in history when there are not very many big explanations for people to get hold of and to try and understand the world, we kind of need to make the world a little bit smaller for ourselves. And maybe, and especially younger people perhaps, maybe when you're older you kind of accept that it's just complicated and that humans have quite enjoyed trying to understand it and there's a pleasure to be had from the uncertainty. But when you're younger, you're looking for your pathway and how you fit in. So I can kind of see the appeal of it in the sense that you need to know what's right and wrong in a very clear sense in order to decide what you're going to do. And I think the thing about woke was that it seemed to offer a way of conducting your interpersonal relationships as well as your kind of grand ambitions at the same time.
That's so interesting. It's the idea of certainty. One of the things that terrifies me most whenever I'm in some kind of altercation with a woke activist is the sheer certainty. The idea, when you hear Owen Jones speak, you know that it's never crossed his mind he might be wrong about anything. It wouldn't even occur to him. Why could that be the case? So, and that's fascinating to me. That lack of humility, but it does exactly what you say. It makes the world more digestible, more comprehensible. That's what every ideology does. I mean, every ideology says we have a set of rules. If you follow these rules, everything will be perfect and nothing will go wrong. And that's the same for political or religious ideology. I think the woke were offering that. Rather than a kind of utopian end goal, I think they were saying, we've got all the answers, and if we can just control the way everyone speaks and set parameters on the limits of acceptable thought, and we can bully anyone who dissents from our ideology, we all end up thinking the same way. They're not about diversity. They're about the exact opposite of diversity. And so they thought that was their goal, and so they used various tactics, and the intimidation aspect, I think, can't be underestimated. I mean, particularly from the Free Speech Union's perspective, everyone who's been defended by the Free Speech Union knows that there has been a strong intimidatory element to what's been going on.
In the early days, we were talking a lot about online mobs,
yes,
which is obviously to do with the fact that the online, the social media companies were responding to mobbings. And I think, I don't know, I can't speak for Toby, but when he set it up, that was very much what we had in mind, was as kind of defending people against online mobbings. Obviously, what's become really, really clear is people are up against their institutionalised power. It is the institutions of which they're part and the places in which they work. It's management. It's like the new way in which people are managed in all different aspects of their life, whether that's when they go to the doctor's surgery or when they go to the workplace. So in that sense, that it seems to be less the product of young activists and more something that was kind of miraculously adopted very, very quickly by a whole layer of the kind of managerial class, if you like, or the bureaucracies of society.
It's so important. I mean, that statistic I mentioned reveals that it's always been a minority even among the young. So we know that the majority of young people don't support this. They're more cowed and they're more scared and they're less likely to speak out. But you're right, it's something that it felt like it magically materialized amongst all of the ruling class at the same time. But how many of them really believe it? That's the question I would like to know. I haven't met anyone who can define gender identity, for instance. Not even trans activists can define it. And yet everyone in the managerial sector, HR, corporate world, goes along with something they don't believe. Did Princeton really believe it when it said it was a systemically racist university? And then, of course, the Department for Education said, well, that's illegal, so we'll take your funding away. And then they said, oh, well, we didn't really mean that. I don't think they believed it. I don't think, so many of racism, for instance, to take that example, is a pretty easy thing to spot, because racists they're pretty overt, let's put it that way. And if you have a racist system in place, that is also likewise overt, because there will be evidence for it, like Jim Crow was a racist system, and you could point to it and say, these people aren't allowed here, that's a system that discriminates against a certain group of people. The charge of systemic racism during the woke era was almost always leveled with a complete absence of evidence. And denial of the absence of evidence was taken as proof of its existence. That's what happened. And you needed these special wizards who were trained in critical race theory, who could detect it, or high priests, or exorcists, or whatever you want to call it. But they weren't looking for evidence, were they? They were making an assertion. I always remember that interview on, is it Good Morning Britain, where Shola Moshogbamima was talking to Philip Schofield, and he was asking about Meghan Markle. He said, well, what's the evidence that the press are racist against her? And she said, well, even the fact you're asking that is proof of the problem. So it's impossible, because, you make an assertion, and you can't deny it. And that's, of course, the premise of Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, which is that all white people are racist and complicit in white supremacy, and the second they deny it, that's evidence of their complicity in white supremacy. So, and this is a white woman, by the way, a racist white woman.
But you can see what she gets out of it, which has been a career.
It's more than that. I mean, the book, she talks about in the book being racist. Mm-hmm. And so what her theory is, effectively, I know this sounds a bit crude, but her theory is, because I'm racist, that must mean all white people are, and therefore that kind of absolves her of her racism. I think that's what's going on there. And that sounds like cod psychology. But there's bits in that book where she talks about, I was invited to a street party, and I'm walking to the street party, and there's two going on simultaneously, and one of them is predominantly white, and one of them is predominantly black. And I stop, and I have a panic attack, because what if I've been invited to the black one, right? And then she says, oh, that must mean we're all white people think like me, and no, that's just you, love. Like, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't be panicking about... Yeah, that's right.
Save the heckling.
Heckling for later, though, yeah. We said it wasn't really a comedy club atmosphere. Also, I might accidentally go into stand-up mode and just totally own you. And it's like, and that's not what this is. So go into character,
So some of those, I mean, the kind of seismic shifts that were either predated woke or maybe coincided with it.
Yeah.
Brexit, Trump.
Yeah.
COVID, BLM. I mean, the response to BLM, as in BLM, you can't explain it by just the few people that set it up. It's the kind of globalised brand of that phenomenon, which really relied on COVID, I think, as the context for that, didn't it? I mean, when I looked at it over here, it seemed to be a great way for young people to get out, having been cooped up for ages, and meet other young people doing kind of something essentially fun.
Especially because the virus refused to attack if it was a Black Lives Matter protest. Do you remember that? And you had medical experts saying the virus it will leave you alone if it's for a good cause. So it was a social justice virus. But I think that's so interesting. I talk in the book about the legacy of Brexit. I think for any hysteria to emerge, there has to be a set of circumstances that are ripe. So when they talk about Salem, there's all sorts of theorizing. Could it have been a fungal infection in the bread? There was a particularly cold year that year, which has all sorts of effects on harvests. There were various sort of tensions, communal tensions about land ownership. So there were all sorts. In other words, the circumstances were ripe. Other people blame it on sexual repression, whatever it might be. But you have to have the right circumstances for any hysteria to sort of take hold. And I think with the woke movement, there's a number of things. So there's the 2016. It's a concatenation of various things, I think. The 2016 Brexit and Trump simultaneously was too much for some people. I think people had... It was, though, wasn't it? I mean, they decided that this was really a struggle between good and evil. And you remember the debates. It was anyone who voted or was considering voting Brexit was a racist, stupid, ignorant monster, which, of course, is going to edge you to vote that way, isn't it? If there was ever a sort of doubt, someone tells me you can't do, of course, we're like that, we're human beings. But so there was that. And if you really think about it, I mean, if you look back on Brexit, it is one of the most bizarre situations because, I don't know about you, but I mean, you're probably very political, but most of my friends didn't know anything about the EU until 2016. And all of a sudden, they're painting their faces in the EU flag colours and screaming how evil anyone who did... They didn't care. They didn't know what it was. I got in a row with a friend about the EU, and I asked him about the EU Commission. I said, can you name anyone on the Commission? Do you know what the Commission is? He had no idea. And yet he was so adamant that anyone who was voting to leave was the epitome, was this diabolic, evil, sulphur-ridden beast. And so it wasn't about Brexit. It wasn't about our membership of an international trading bloc. It was that was a proxy for something else. And similarly with Trump, because with Trump it became clear that people were interpreting that as good versus evil again. And so something broke in our brains, I think, in 2016. And I think you had a kind of ideological civil war. And that set, I think, the groundwork for the later explosion of 2020. And again, with 2020, it was a combination of lockdown, social media, people being driven mad by being alone or having to stay at home with their partners. And that, combined with the George Floyd, that was the tinderbox, wasn't it? And then it all explodes. I think if one of those pieces had been missing, it might not have happened. I think I make the point in the book. I think if we'd have voted to leave the EU in 2010, people would have shrugged their shoulders and be like, okay. And I don't think you would have had political elites on both sides of the House trying to thwart the vote. I think they would have observed the loser's consent. I think there was something about when it happened. Mm. This is all theorizing, by the way. I could be wrong about absolutely everything. But it does feel like it's been building up. Do you remember in 2019, everyone was writing those articles about how woke is over? Mm. And then that spark happened in 2020, and then it really went mad.
But with Brexit, I mean, why that quite technical, in a way, question of our relationship to the EU, to markets, also the big questions about democracy as well. But why that was it wasn't an obvious to me what the ideological split was there. And right. It wasn't, but the way it was very spontaneously interpreted was as an existential crisis, and that somehow nothing would be the same again. And so therefore, for people who were Remainers, there was that sense that you people, you leavers, have somehow really taken everything away from us and you've turned the world upside down. Now, you can see that a bit more clearly with Trump because, he did seem to be representing something very different, a different set of values. But with Brexit, it's not clear what the values were that people were spotting and worrying about.
It's particularly odd because the left had always opposed the EU. Yeah. Mm. That's what's really weird about it, because it started being interpreted as a left versus right issue. I mean, we know that Jeremy Corbyn voted leave. Of course he did. He'd been campaigning for 40 years. And then, people like Barbara Castle and Tony Benn and, all the great leftist luminaries, the idea that it was sudden... Even Owen Jones wrote an article saying that leaving the EU would be a good left-wing thing to do. So it became something it absolutely isn't. It became something, I mean, I do think, looking back on that footage, you know, the people doing the weird dances in Parliament Square and avant-garde performance art in the EU flag. I mean, you look at it, you think, they must, are they embarrassed now? Do they look back and think, is AC Grayling embarrassed? You know, to be that zealous about something, about thwarting democracy, that's effectively what it was.
But do you think, so with Brexit, it seems a bit clearer to me that there was a sort of unspoken class element, very, very strong reaction.
Or spoken.
Well, it became, but expressed in ways that it wouldn't have been in the past. So people who thought they were on the side of working class people because they thought that's who they were. They were kind of liberal or left leaning. We side with those people. We just don't really want to see them, and we don't really want them to say what they think.
Yeah.
So suddenly, the idea of this other group of Brits who somehow have these views that we cannot understand and probably have values that we thought we'd managed to suppress and go beyond, like racism, like homophobia, like sexism. There's a sense that suddenly those people who were somehow, what was projected onto them were all these old values, were suddenly resurgent.
But that's it, it's projection. Do you remember the key allegation that people were voting Brexit because they were nostalgic for a colonial past? I haven't met anyone who falls into that category, and I don't think they have.
Well, I think there's a few of them emerging now.
Maybe, okay.
We should come on to that.
But at the time, it was like this fantasy that they couldn't substantiate. They'd concocted this idea. So I think what your theory there is right, that this was kind of projection of a kind of fear. We'd moved so far, and we'd gone to a position where we were going in the right direction when it comes to race relations and that kind of thing. Was it maybe a fear that it was just simmering underneath, ready to re-emerge in some way or another? I think, I mean, I'm not trained to know that. It's an anthropologist's or a psychologist's discussion why that happened. But certainly, I mean, there were books written about the nostalgia for a colonial past. Who were they talking about? I mean, they couldn't point to anyone who fulfilled that category. It was very much a fantasy debate. And it became utterly fantastical when they started saying that people didn't know what they voted for. I've never seen any vote more debated, more discussed for months and months. I've never seen the public more politically energized. And so there was a real paternalism there as well, wasn't there, that these people couldn't possibly understand something so complicated. And that was coming from the very same people who were reducing it all to good versus evil and you're racist and stupid if you disagree. That was their level of sophistication. So for them to say that the little people don't get it was... there's some bloody gall there.
So maybe the great fear was of a referendum itself. I mean, almost no matter what you offered a referendum.
Could have been anything.
The fact that a referendum is just such a clear majority vote.
Yes.
That would be frightening in itself because...
Yeah, maybe.
Suddenly the people that are normally invisible become visible to you through the vote.
Yeah. Well, there's always been this fear of the population, the fear of the populace and and populism, which has now become such a sneered word.
Yeah.
It's a debate that goes right back to the Romans, to Julius Caesar, this populist leader, killed off by the elites. Who do you side with when you watch that play? It's difficult to know. You know, but it's an old debate. But certainly I think people in power, and, you know, people in power should fear the demos because they can get rid of them.
Yeah, so that kind of, the traducing of the demos that happened through Brexit and then also through the kind of reaction over here to the Trump vote, you can see the kind of, that hasn't gone away at all, I don't think. It's still absolutely there. And of course, when Trump gets re-elected, it's even more hysterical.
Although it wasn't quite when he was re-elected instant. Do you remember we were expecting the kind of meltdowns we had in 2016 and they were a bit more subdued. And it's only now when they found a proxy through Elon Musk and they've started scratching swastikas on the side of Cybertrucks that they've all sort of really, the hysteria is back, isn't it? For some reason, they didn't quite... I think it was because he won the popular vote as well as the Senate, as well as the House.
But there's also a kind of embeddedness to it now, isn't there? Which, you know, I was with somebody at the weekend I'd not met before who... There's a package of opinions that go together, you know, on Brexit, on Trump, and you only need to drop one name that's kind of new to them or familiar to them, but not to be discussed. It's like Voldemort or something. You mention, I don't know, I can't even think who I mentioned. I mentioned some public thinker, and the immediate response, oh, well, aren't they quite right-wing?
Yes.
And it was probably you, Andrew.
Wow. Okay, yeah.
But, you know, that idea that somehow, oh, they're far right, they're hard right, they're right-wing, they're racist, they're homophobic, they're transphobic. It's a break, isn't it, on any kind of opening up of a discussion.
It might also be more of the projection you're describing. Because one of the things about the woke is when someone says to me a woke catchphrase, like toxic masculinity, I can tell you their opinion on every subject across the board. And that's why we call it the omnicause. That's why Greta Thunberg can be shouting about the environment, then she can put on a pro-Palestine outfit, because it's a natural segue. Because if you believe one, you have to believe the other. It's why you ended up with those Black Lives Matter fists with rainbow flags around them. It's why you get queers for Palestine. Right? It's the same reason, right? It's all very, very predictable. And so maybe they think the same way. Maybe they think, well, if we're the good guys, then it applies to the villains as well. Mm-hmm. And so if you support Elon Musk, you must support this, you must support that, you must support that. But actually, there's a lot of diversity and discussion and disagreement about these various issues.
But do you think that your diagnosis that woke is coming to an end, it's kind of coming on the down?
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible that that's come about because there are certain openings where people have broken through, like, for example, women in sports? I think that's one of those examples where people who are otherwise very woke, women in sport, I've had lots of conversations with people where that's the one thing where they'll go the other way. And actually, for a lot of people,
that's a good point.
Same with Israel and Gaza, they'll go the other way on it because of other allegiances or other loyalties. Yeah. So there must be there must have been chinks in it. That's not a word you can't use.
Yeah, steady on. I think
that have allowed a break for it to start to kind of fall apart.
So what I think that's more to do with is, I think so much of the woke movement was sustained through this patina of some kind of illusion, some kind of fantasy that you just need to break through every now and then. And the way that you break through is to be confronted with reality like a sledgehammer. And there are some basic things that happen, like Leah Thomas standing on the winner's podium, this huge 6'2" bloke standing over the women who he just absolutely thrashed and you see that, or Laurel Hubbard, the weightlifter, massive hulking ogre of a man next to these women, which is what South Park did a sketch exactly like that a number of years ago. So when you see that photograph, that image, I think it shakes you. It's like all of a sudden, that image of Isla Bryson, double rapist in a dodgy wig, right? A real name, Adam Graham. I think seeing that, being confronted with that, so many people, so much of the woke movement has depended upon fellow travellers being gulled by their illusions. Mm-hmm. I quote in the book Kathy Burke, the left-wing comedian, very talented comedian and actor, who says, well, being woke is just being nice. You should be woke. Everyone should be woke. And then I also quote Theresa May, who said exactly the same thing. And that just shows this was never about left and right, by the way. This was about people being gulled. I mean, Theresa May says she's woke and proud. Okay? So these are people who are gulled into a belief system because they don't really understand what it is. But then when you see men in women's sports, when you see the images, when you see the BBC doing an article, woman exposes her penis, and you see this bloke, not that you needed to see him because the sentence gives it away, and you are confronted with the reality that your brain won't let you persist with the illusion anymore. I think that must be part of it, don't you think?
But then there's also, I mean, probably a majority of people who, had you told them what woke thinking was, wouldn't have believed you.
No.
And so kind of didn't really notice it particularly because they couldn't quite believe it. So it was, I remember having conversations with people where they said, with my parents about, what is it that J.K. Rowling's supposed to have said?
Yeah.
And you try to explain it, and they just cannot understand why people would have a problem with it. Or, and the women in sport was one in particular, people would not believe until they actually see Leah Thomas that is happening. And then they might think, well, that's just an aberration, that's just in that sport. And then you need all the hard work that people have done in order to prove to people that this is what in fact was going on.
Yes.
There's been a huge muddying of the water, hasn't there, by the kind of core vanguard, if you like, of the woke movement.
Which is why when you see studies like the Cass Review, it's impossible then to go, that's not an ideologue, that's someone who was chosen because she had relatively little skin in the game. She was top paediatrician, rigorous research for 4 years. It gets difficult I know people were trying to smear it as far right, but it just doesn't work anymore. You know, it's like when, what was it, Emily Maitlis calling Rupert Lowe racist, just straight away. Well, the word doesn't work anymore. People don't buy that anymore. Even, unfortunately, when it's used to actual racists. The word has been completely denuded. So I think that's, yeah, I think that is a significant aspect of it, I would suggest. I hadn't thought there, but it's gone.
That's okay. There's plenty more.
Yeah, yeah.
In the book and elsewhere. What's so just before we go out for questions, I'm going to pick up on a couple of things that people who most of you won't have read the book yet, so I'm going to pick on some things that I know you haven't particularly been asked about so far. One is you do a really fascinating kind of dive into George Orwell, and you're reading essays way beyond the normal text that people have read of Orwell, and you know you're doing it in a way because so many people started to refer to Orwell, Animal Farm or 1984, both on the kind of the Trump, those who fearing Trump and are predicting fascism, and actually on kind of the pro-free speech side, actually kind of citing Big Brother, etc. So what was it that you found in, or were looking for perhaps in Orwell that you found there, looking again?
I've always adored Orwell. I think it's a fantastic, just on the purely, in terms of as a prose stylist, is absolutely tremendous. If you read his essays, it's just like a sucker punch. They're incredible. He always opens every essay with an incredibly brilliant first sentence. He knows how to grab you. He's got a wonderful quality in his essays of trying to test his own theses, almost like he's trying to work out his own position as he goes along. He's very honest. He's very open. He's willing to concede when he's wrong or when he could be wrong. It's very refreshing because you don't see that very much now at all. And they haven't dated very much at all. There's an essay about the misuse of the word fascism. And this is in the middle of the Second World War. He's saying fascism seems to be able to mean anything. I've heard it describing shopkeepers or, you know, food I don't like or you know, and it's exactly what's happening today. And he writes it all so well. And I was conscious that, well, exactly as you say, after Trump's election in 2016, I think sales of 1984 rocketed. I mentioned the actual statistic in the book, but it was mostly left-wing activists saying, do we have another Big Brother now? And I do wonder, were they able to see themselves in that book? Because it more accurately reflects a lot of them, of course. But I'm just very interested in Orwell as well, because he seems to be warning continually against the potential for authoritarianism from any side. Bear in mind, he couldn't get Animal Farm published for over a year because he was attacking their allies. Because he's a left-wing, staunchly left-wing, always was. But he knew that leftism had authoritarian potential as well. And what's worse is he was willing to say it. He has a wonderful essay about that phrase, playing into the hands of. And the idea is that that's used as a kind of incantation to stop you from speaking. So someone will say, well, you can't criticize this on your own side because that's playing into the hands of the other side. I get that all the time. Like if I criticize someone on my side or someone who agrees with me, I'm told, well, that's just going to be ammunition to the other side. But as Orwell says, you have to. If you care about your cause, you have to be able to take your own side to task. So he's very aware of that. He's very alert to it. And he's so astute when it comes to this question of authoritarianism. And it's all in those, it's obviously in Animal Farm, it's obviously in 1984, but it's really deeply embedded in the essays. And the essays, I think, convey it even more effectively. So that's why. And the reason it came up is because during lockdown, I'd always read Orwell, I'd read the novels. And during lockdown, I had a walk I did every day. It was about an hour's walk to a village called Wallington. And I'd go to this crossroads and then walk back. And I'd done it, you know, dozens of times. And I didn't realize I was stopping at George Orwell's house where he wrote Animal Farm. I didn't even see the plaque. That's how, you know, just stupid I am.
The mask too
I
high
don't know
up.
what. Yeah, I was masked, triple masked, as all responsible citizens should be. And then, so that's where I started reading more of the essays, and I think he's just an incredible figure. So yeah, I talk about that, and I talk about the way in which he transcends that binary that we've developed in terms of exactly what you say about having a set of rules that you have to abide by. This is a man who is a leftist, but is also really a social conservative. And if you read his essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, you will very clearly see where he's coming from. And this idea that in order to cultivate a social contract within which liberalism can thrive, you actually do need tradition, and you do need shared values, and you do need social responsibility. And I suppose this is something we'll probably get onto, because I spend a lot of time in the book talking about what liberalism means and what it doesn't mean. And I fear that, well, we've got the basic problem is that liberal means all sorts of things to different liberal thinkers. Then you've got the problem that the liberals in Australia are right-wing, the liberals in America are left-wing. What does it actually mean? But I'm talking about classical liberal values. And too often I think people say that liberalism is just a free-for-all, it's just complete anarchy, it's selfish, it's do whatever you want and don't care about anyone else. Patrick Deneen wrote a whole book called Why Liberalism Failed. That's his thesis. I don't think that's what liberalism is. I think liberalism cannot thrive unless you have social responsibility and a sense of that social contract which we build together gradually over time. And it's hard. I quote Milton as well, of course, because Milton wrote a sonnet about this, and he makes the very clear distinction. When you say that someone is simply out for themselves and is going to do whatever the hell they want, irrespective of anyone else or their rights, that's not liberty, that's license. And that's a really important distinction that people have completely forgotten about. And he wrote a sonnet complaining about this because he'd written an essay effectively arguing for the validity of divorce because he didn't like his wife and he wanted an excuse to divorce her. And he wrote this thing, and a lot of his peers had a go at him saying, you're just, this is anarchy you're after. And he wrote this sonnet saying, no, I'm calling for liberty, not for license. And I think if we could restate that understanding of liberalism, that understanding of liberty, we might actually get somewhere.
But the tension that I always see in that, though, is between being so open-minded that your brain falls out.
Yeah.
So the kind of hyper-liberal side of things. But on the other hand, that kind of more conservative closed-mindedness, which is more secure, and it kind of can give you a pathway through things and can give you moral certainty, but also can produce philistinism.
Yeah.
And kind of prejudices that close down your orientation towards the world. So can liberalism take something of conservatism within it?
So there's the question with philistinism, for instance. If a liberal system is operating, functioning adequately, it will involve that piecemeal development of a social contract that is messy and is continually renegotiated. And the idea, obviously, at the heart of liberalism is you can do whatever you want right up to the point that it encroaches on the rights of others. That's a really important aspect of it. But so you are at liberty to break the social contract, so long as you're not encroaching on someone else's rights. But a social contract that has been developed adequately will have consequences for that. You know, for instance, we all know now that we don't like to, in our society, express grotesquely racist sentiments in public. We've cultivated that. We've agreed upon it, not through coercion and bullying and all the rest of it. We've come to this realization. But in a liberal system, you should be able to still make those statements if you want to. But of course, you make yourself a pariah because of the social contract that we've developed. Does that kind of make sense? Like, philistinism's the same. But you can be a Philistine.
But is that... Sorry, but isn't that... Is less to do with the fact that we feel that we cannot say those impolite, grotesque things than actually the belief in a really fundamental inequality between races has melted away, isn't it? And
but how did it melt away? That's the question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it melted away because of the work of the civil rights luminaries of the 1960s, instigating a process that took a hell of a long time. And it's so different to the approach of the woke. I mean, if you just compare it, I mean, if you take the gay rights issue, I don't think gay rights, and if you look at the early years of Stonewall, it's certainly the case, that gay rights were never secured by whacking people over the head with a brick and saying, don't use the words that I don't want you to use, or phoning the police and having people arrested if they didn't go along with your speech codes. It was never achieved that way, and I think if they'd have attempted it that way, it wouldn't have worked. I think most people who were part of Stonewall at that time would have acknowledged that. Whereas what the trans activists did is they said, we will weaponize the police force to have you arrested if you misgender or whatever it might be. We will physically assault you. We will ruin your life. We will smear you online. We will send you threats of rape and death, etc. So I would say that the example of the great liberal thinkers of the 1960s and their success is what I'm advocating for.
So to contrast to that then, there's a really interesting section on Mary Whitehouse.
Yeah.
I'm really curious as to why you went and read her book and found out more about her, and what is it you're drawing out? You have to explain to people who she was. I can see the demographics. A lot of you will know who she was, but some of you may not, and our international listeners may not.
I think anyone under 30 won't know, probably. But no, they're not here, are they? So it doesn't matter. But Mary Whitehouse was a campaigner, a Christian woman who began campaigning in the 1960s. She was an art teacher. She left her job to full-time tackle the BBC, which at the time was run by the Director General Hugh Green. And she saw this as degeneracy being promoted through this relatively new invention of the television. And so she invented a campaign called the Clean Up TV campaign with a vicar's wife called Nora Buckland. And she's very well known, obviously, for her perm and handbag and twin set and pearls and that very iconic, almost iconic image. And she became a real thorn in the side for the BBC. And I started out being interested in her because I wanted to make the point that in a way her philosophy has won out. She had a conviction that the television programs that people watched would have the effect of contaminating them. That's what the woke believe. It's the same thing. That's why they censor comedy shows. That's why they want certain films to be banned, certain comedians to be banned, because they think if you listen to those words, you will become activated in some negative way. The example I often give is the republication of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain without the racial epithets. But Huckleberry Finn is an anti-racist satire. So without the racism, what's it satirizing? The book doesn't actually work once you publish it in that form. It was actually republished without those words. Or the example of P.G. Wodehouse, who's been recently republished and rewritten by sensitivity readers who have the arrogance to think that they can improve upon his prose. Roald Dahl, same thing. Ian Fleming, same thing. Agatha Christie, I'm not sure why, but Agatha Christie as well. That kind of instinct, which has now won out, and the very existence of sensitivity readers in the publishing industry and their prevalence.
Did you have one on the book?
No, can you imagine? I would have killed them.
Some of the
Yeah. No. I have a publisher who wouldn't dare do that. But it won out. So that was Mary Whitehouse's key philosophy. And I suppose what I was trying to explore initially was this idea that we get complacent if we say that this kind of authoritarian censorial quality is simply a product of the left. Certainly because most of us are old enough to remember when it was the Daily Mail and the Daily Express saying, ban this filth, get rid of all the rest of it. Of course, as you know, Mary Whitehouse successfully prosecuted the Gay News for a poem which sexualized Jesus. And I think that was the last case of blasphemy, successful prosecution of blasphemy in the UK. So I was interested in the way that, and she was a very kind of traditionalist, Christian, right-leaning figure, and yet she had an identical belief system to the woke, and I was interested in exploring how that could work. I mean, I'm trying to make the point that I don't think it's about left and right, effectively. But then I discovered something else. Well, I read a number of her books, and one thing I really found fascinating about her is she was completely misrepresented. And there's a really simple thing you can do. If you watch old videos of Mary Whitehouse, we've got the kind of folk devil in our heads of this stuffy school mistress kind of, hitting people with the handbags and, slapping kids with rulers. But it's not what it is. And if you watch her in interviews, she is generous and open, has a great sense of humor. I mentioned an interview from the 80s when Rambo came out. And of course, she really disapproved of Rambo and Sylvester Stallone and all the rest of it. And to goad her, the presenter has brought on a bunch of young, muscular, oiled men with fake machine guns, dressed as Rambo, and they parade between her. She starts joking with them and having a laugh with them and just treats them like other human beings. And they expected her to have a conniption. But she didn't, and Michael Winner's sitting there sneering and trying to goad her, and he's the one that comes off looking bad. So it's very interesting when you watch her. She was tough, she was principled, she was receiving death threats of violence. There was one moment which I mentioned in the book about police turning up at her door saying, we've had notification that some thugs are on their way to beat you up from London. This is a scary life to lead for someone who didn't need to get involved in this. So the more I read of her, the more admiration I had for her, while at the same time completely fundamentally disagreeing with her position on art, because I think she was fundamentally wrong. And in a way that I find really rebarbative, the idea of someone saying that artistic freedom should be curbed. Because it wasn't just, although she never admitted to being pro-censorship, she was. She even says in one of the books that she sort of would like to if she could. And it wasn't just that she was saying this kind of representation is damaging. She was also saying it should be the kind of representation I want. It should be proselytizing. It should be a Christian message. So that is a form of authoritarianism, and it's very anti-art, and I do think it's a form of philistinism. But I think with her, it came from a very genuine, principled place. She was terrified by what might happen to children. Her concerns were completely valid, as far as I can see. She also, some of the complaints that she put in sound a lot like the woke. She complained about a play about homosexuals in the 1960s on the BBC, and she said to the BBC, what if homosexual people watch this? This is about homosexuals who end up committing suicide. That's not good for them. You should look out for that. That's not what people expect. Similarly with race relations, she was concerned about that. So the more you look into it, the more surprised you will be, I think. And there's another really I'm sorry, I might be boring about this because I'm a bit of a Mary Whitehouse freak at the moment, but there's another aspect to this which is so fascinating. The BBC now have come around to her worldview when it comes to the effect of media on the great unwashed. They completely are Mary Whitehouse to a T. But in another way, they are the complete antithesis, which is that when Mary Whitehouse was taking on Hugh Green, they were, the BBC I mean, deliberately putting out provocative ideological material against the will of the general public. People didn't want the stuff they were putting out. And every time people complained, they put out more of it. That sounds a lot like the BBC today, doesn't it? And so in a way, Whitehouse was the same as the BBC and the exact opposite of the BBC. And I just found that a really interesting quality. I mean, I've had trouble with the BBC because they didn't, do you know they haven't reported once on the WPATH files, which was the revelations that the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, that the experts within that field knew that many of those patients couldn't give informed consent and proceeded in any case. It is a medical scandal of monumental proportions, which has resulted in the mutilation and castration of kids. I mean, there are, I think the last study, it was something like over 6,000 under 18s in America having double mastectomies for this religion. And that's come about largely because of WPATH. This scandal should have been not just on the BBC that day, but for weeks thereafter. On the day the scandal broke, they had a story about the University of Essex putting up a statue to a cat. They had a story about buses in Scotland being run on vegetable oil. They had stuff about beavers being put into a park somewhere. I can't remember where it was. So, but they're not interested in something that's actually significant. And it's not good enough to... So I emailed them about this multiple times, and I got nothing back. For
Mary Whitehouse kind of way.
Like a Mary Whitehouse kind of way. Exactly. I was doing it in my capacity at GB News, actually, because I was doing reporting on the WPATH files, and I wanted to know why the BBC weren't reporting on it. I got nothing back for months. I eventually, because I went over their heads a little bit, and I used a contact within the BBC to go to their boss, and I got a message back saying, and it was a one-line thing, editors decide on the day what they want to report on, something like that. Didn't answer the question at all. And I asked it again after the cast review came out, and I got the same one sentence back. But it is an incredible dereliction of duty for the BBC to ignore one of the major medical scandals of our time. It is also a dereliction of their duty to have such an ideological bias that it is now, as far as I can see, irredeemable. You know, we can have debates about their political bias, because some people think they're too far left-wing, too far right-wing. I think they do a pretty good job, actually, of holding both parties to account. But when it comes to ideology, they are hopelessly lost. They have a gender identity correspondent, which is the equivalent of having a transubstantiation correspondent. They have an identity unit which uses various internal networks to put pressure onto departments so they don't report the things that matter. They put, there was a BBC children's show came out a few years ago where they're talking about 2 children, about how you can have over 100 genders. This stuff is not impartial broadcasting by any stretch of the imagination. And every time people complain, people like me, they do it more. They goad you. You know, they did it with that weird episode of Doctors. Do you remember the one about furries? Where they had a storyline where a guy was coming out as someone who liked to dress up as a bear, because that's who he is innately. And He comes out to his grandfather. His grandfather's like, "Oh, get out of my house! You're a pervert." It was like, but it came across as a satire of a gay coming out story. It came across as really homophobic. But what it was the BBC trying to promote furry as a legitimate identity. And that sounds nuts. It's again this thing about when we look back, this will sound insane. But let's not forget that in the WPATH standards of care, which was the benchmark for all major medical institutions across the globe, including for a long time the NHS, they had a section on eunuch identity, right? It's called this was, and I'm going to go into this a little bit because I mentioned it in the book. So Genevieve Gluck at Redux magazine went into detail on this. There was a link in the original draft of the Standards of Care to a website called the Eunuch Archive, which contained thousands of pornographic stories about the castration of minors for sexual pleasure. And that draft document was uploaded to NHS Scotland official site. Now, this sounds crazy. If you look at Genevieve's article on this, you'll get the full detail on it. It sounds made up. You know, the NHS effectively promoting a paedophilic castration porn site. But it happened. We have the receipts. So, you know, that's absolutely mad. Why wouldn't the BBC report on that? Why not?
It's a very strange mixture there of taboo busting. So that what looks like liberalism. So you kind of break down every taboo that's still standing. But on the other hand, you protect the taboo busting by imposing new taboos, and you make it impossible to question the undoing of those taboos. So you kind of say about furries,
yes,
and you kind of portray them, and you put drag queens and everything. But on the other hand, anybody who questions this new taboo-busting phenomenon is kind of subject to a taboo and stigmatised.
It's really important to, I mean, yes, obviously the question of something like paedophilia is not a liberal question. It is not liberal because that's no child can consent to liberalism has to have the rule of law as part of it.
So much of these new taboo-busting ones,
they're not
short of,
yes,
but they've been fought out through children. It has been about children.
That's right. And actually, the furry thing, which is a very explicitly sexualized idea, has been foisted onto kids. And this has created all sorts of problems, you know, because you've got adult fetishists behaving in this way. I mean, this has actually resulted in a real degradation of support for gay rights. Because people have bought into, again, the LGBTQIA plus thing, which is not a thing. There's LGB, and everything that follows it is its antithesis. But they force them together. The TQ plus is a parasite onto something that's very, very different. And, you know, as LGBT Alliance have said, you know, they're free to go off and fight for their rights, but it's directly antithetical. But you're right, there is a problem there. But I don't consider it liberal to be foisting an idea or a view on someone else against their wishes. And I think that is what the BBC is doing. I don't think they're doing it for taboo busting. That's like an artistic argument, isn't it? Doctors is not a work of art. It's a work of utter trash. You know, it's in fact, Doctors, the best you could say about it is that it's propaganda. That is very ham-fisted propaganda. That's the best you could say about it.
But aren't they picking? I mean, the soap operas took up that role quite a long time ago, didn't they? With the lesbian kiss in Brookside, the gay kiss in EastEnders. So that kind of idea that the BBC or Channel 4 as well as sort of their role is to somehow drag the rest of society forwards. Sure.
Yes. I mean, there is an argument to be made for that, isn't there? It's like if you're watching TV, soap opera set in the middle of London, and you never see a black person, or you never see a gay person, that's insane, just in terms of it doesn't make sense, because soap operas purport to reflect something about real life. So there's a case to be made for that kind of element to it, and representation, if you want to say, at a time when there was no representation. You know, it makes absolutely no sense that MTV would refuse to play any music by black artists before Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. It makes no sense. Obviously, that's when those cases have to be made. We're way beyond that now, and that's not what it is now. When you see a gay kiss thrust into some Ewok story or whatever, or when you see the Transformers announcing their pronouns. Did you see that one? A robot saying that he's they, them.
You said we weren't going to mention pronouns.
Sorry. Okay, but let's just do it. I'll get it out of my system now. Doctor Who. Did you see the Meep? There's an alien called the Meep, and the Doctor misgenders the Meep. And the Doctor's assistant says, "How did you know the Meep was he?" And he says, "Oh, that's such a good question. What are your pronouns, Meep?" And the meep says, my pronouns are the meep, the definite article. That's aimed at kids, right? So it's insufferable. I mean, just on the level of bad taste, it should be banned. Like, I would lose my free speech stance on that.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's just...
Suddenly become censorious.
But it's a good... But I suppose to go back to the point, was the same thing was happening in Mary Whitehouse's time. Something that wasn't popular being foisted on, let's not forget, it was the state broadcaster.
Yes.
So they have actually a duty not to behave in this way.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Let's go we're going to go to the Zoom chat first. So, Vinay, you've got the microphone. Give me the question with the most upvotes that makes sense.
Oh, God.
Yes, okay, cool, it works. So the most popular question is about the tipping event that will signify how woke has been extinguished. So the question is, what do you think will be the tipping point event that signifies the extinguishing of woke, or is as good as extinguished?
So the ones I mentioned at the start of the book are the Supreme Court ruling, saying that sex in the Equality Act means sex. It's hilarious that we had to have judges gather to decide that, but there we are. That's major. That's going to change everything. And although you've got lots and lots of companies and charities declaring that their intention is to break the law, what's rather useful is that they're posting their intention to break the law online, aren't they? Which also makes them the worst criminals ever. Al Capone didn't do that. So I think that's going to be major. That can have a rippling effect. And eventually it might reach the antipodes, so... Because at the moment in Australia, the Sal Grover case, the judge ruled that sex is changeable, apparently, the judge says. The judge is wrong. And what will happen, of course, is this Supreme Court ruling will have the effect of, I think, it will... The other thing I mentioned is the Cass Review, which, for all the activists' attempt to smear Hillary Cass as a far-right figure, it just hasn't worked. It was never convincing. And it is going to take a lot in America for that to... But, with Trump... It might happen. Trump is the other example I mentioned. Whatever you think about Trump and whatever your politics, we have to acknowledge that he was elected on an anti-woke ticket, and quite overwhelmingly so. When he signed that executive order saying that men should not be in women's sports, that was a position that was supported overwhelmingly by the Democrats as well. I think the votes come out something like 67% of Democrat voters. So he'd found this unifying cause. The anti-woke thing, he won the whole clean sweep. And one of the interesting stats that I mentioned is the one from Future Forward, which is a Democratic think tank, hostile to Trump, if anything. But they found that the advert regarding trans issues actuated a 2.7 shift in Trump's favor among anyone who saw it, which is a huge shift, which could actually swing a state. And that was the advert, if you remember, because Kamala Harris had said that she supported prisoners transing and that she would fund prisoners to have trans surgery. And so his slogan was, Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you. And it's very sharp, and it had a real seismic effect. So the fact that he was, I'm so sick of these people saying the culture war doesn't matter. Woke issues don't affect anyone. It's just given us a new leader of the free world. It matters a lot. It affects everyone. And so I think the combination of the Cass Review, Supreme Court, Trump, then the rolling back of DEI, then Doge, when we suddenly discovered that all these politicians in Washington had their pet projects and they're funding, Guatemalan LGBTQ pottery to the tune of millions of dollars, which sounds frivolous and silly, but it does suggest a degree of rot going on. We've got that. We've got DEI being stripped out of Facebook. Jeff Bezos crossing the aisle, maybe for cynical capitalistic reasons. Who knows? But it's still happening. DEI is pretty much dead in the water. I think people have realized, that a meritocracy is a better system. And the DEI industry is collapsing. This is an industry that is worth $9 billion annually. It is a capitalist, corporatist, upper middle class, top-down industry that does not support working-class people. But that's going to die now. So you're not going to get Robin DiAngelo getting paid 15 grand to tell you to try and be less white, which is what she did at Coca-Cola.
We've just reported on the the National Theatre of Scotland, where they were employing the British equivalent of Robin DiAngelo to school actors in the National Theatre of Scotland.
Because the theatre is completely lost at the moment. Yeah, so this is the point I was going to get to, which is that these things are all really seismic to the extent that I don't think it can go back. I don't think... The argument I make in the book is not that woke is over, yay, let's have a party. The argument is all of the major death throes are occurring. It might be a long, drawn-out death rattle. It might take years, it might take decades, but it's starting now. And I think I will be proven right on that. But I'm not suggesting that it's going to stop. And every day there are more stories about the craziness. I mentioned the Lady Hale thing. Shakespeare Birthplace Trust want to decolonise his collection. They've announced that. You know, the NHS is still saying that toddlers can be trans. So it's not going to happen overnight. But I think it's like a game of Jenga. It's sort of wobbling now. And I don't think you can steady that tower.
Okay, we'll wait for it to topple.
Well, yeah.
Finally, yeah. Well, we won't wait, we'll push it. We'll give it a good push.
Exactly. You cheat at Jenga.
Is there a second question?
Yeah, I'm just linking on what Andrew said at the end about woke not being over. Maybe it is over, maybe it isn't. One of another popular questions was about sectarianism, two-tier policing. Given these things, which the person writing this question takes as given, do you agree that civil war is not a matter of if, but when?
Wow, that's so alarmist.
I know, yeah.
No, I don't think that's inevitable. Look, I think, no, because of precisely the things that I've been outlining. Things may be more likely in America, if anything. I think there is a way to grapple with this. I mean, one of the arguments I make in the book is that we can look to Sweden as a test case of what not to do. We can see it as a cautionary tale. It might be that Sweden is lost, actually. I was there a couple of years ago talking to, I mean, you know what Swedes are like. They're all very, very nice, liberal, lovely, sweet people. And they all assumed that they could have mass unfettered immigration without any attempt at assimilation, and everyone would just play along and treat women well and treat each other well. And of course it didn't happen. So now Sweden is, with the exception of Mexico, is the country with the most bomb and gun attacks of any nation not at war. And Sweden used to be a high-trust society, low-crime society, and this has happened very, very rapidly. And this is because it's a nation of good, liberal-minded, compassionate, decent people who misunderstood the significance of culture and how different cultures operate and believe. If you import mass numbers from a culture that not only doesn't value democracy, but is hostile to it, and is hostile to women's rights, this isn't a racist point. This is a point about culture. I mean, the argument I make is that, you know, if a man is raised in Scotland or a man is raised in the tribal regions of Pakistan, I don't think either of those men are more innately likely to commit sexual assault. But I think if you're brought up in a country where women are completely treated like meat and not valued and second-class citizens, you are more likely to produce rapists. That is not a racist point, and it shouldn't be a controversial point. And that's something I think we are at a kind of tipping point, though, with the two-tier policing example, which is very, very important, I think. It's undeniably true. We have enough whistleblowers from the police saying that they are told explicitly to treat certain communities differently. Multiculturalism, I think, has been a disaster. I welcome anyone who wants to disagree with that. I'm not talking about multiracialism, just to be clear. I'm talking about the idea that people should live in their own ghettos, have their own parallel systems of law. The existence of Sharia courts or rabbinical courts in the country should never happen. It should be a system of law that applies to absolutely everyone. I think this is an absolute no-brainer. The other thing that you're doing when you say an Islamic conclave or enclave can behave as it wants and implement its own laws, what about the women in that society? What about the gay people in that society? What you're doing is you're siding with the most ultra-reactionary faction and powerful faction within that community. So it's not progressive, it's the opposite of progressive. The two-tier issue is so significant. This is where we could win it. This is where we could flip it, I think. If now obviously not under the current Labour government, but if there was a party in power with the political will to strip out the ideology from the quangos, to abolish the College of Policing, and which I don't think is an authoritarian thing, because the College of Policing has proven itself to be unfit for purpose. It cannot operate. I say that because it is training our police that it's their job to audit the emotions and thoughts and speech of the citizens. It's misrepresenting what their job is, and that's why the police burst in to people's houses and comment on the very Brexity books on the shelf and put people in a cell for no reason whatsoever. It's why people are in prison now for offensive tweets and memes, right? Which could never have had any possibility of inciting violence, but we can get into that if you want to. But the police are being mistrained to be activists, to be the paramilitary wing of Stonewall, as Harry Miller once put it. You know, that's a real problem. Activists are also impervious to instructions. I mentioned the people saying they're going to ignore the Supreme Court ruling. The College of Policing, let's not forget, was instructed by the Home Office twice. Two successive Home Secretaries said, you cannot do this anymore. Non-crime hate incidents have to go. It is not your job to investigate non-crime. And they ignored them, right? I bet most people in here have non-crime hate incidents against their name, but you won't know because you have to request the information. It'll be there somewhere on a file, and it might show up on a disclosure and barring service check. But even if it didn't, the principle should surely stand that the police have no right to be probing around your private thoughts. And they certainly shouldn't be recording you on a blacklist because someone else has decided that something you said or did that was not criminal was somehow motivated by hatred for a protected characteristic, as though their pretensions to telepathy transcends any necessity for evidence or serious, rigorous investigation on the part of the police. So I think, I'm sounding quite angry, I'll calm it down. I think the college policing has to go. I think it's no accident. The High Court told them to stop it. The bloody High Court told them to stop it, and they ignored them. So it's got to go. I don't think it's coincidental that when they introduced non-crime hate incidents, without a government mandate, they just did it. Years and years after Stephen Lawrence, so don't give me this argument about it came out from the Lawrence Report, because it's a long time. Didn't have to happen. Obviously, if we had a political party in power, the Tories didn't do it. They were in power for, 14 years? They presided over the worst of all this stuff. They allowed it to happen. They kept talking about the bonfire of the Quangos. It felt pretty cold to me. So I think we need someone in charge, because for a long time we couldn't vote the woke out. They were there on the left, they were there on the right, you couldn't get rid of them. They had no democratic mandate, so they weren't responsive to democracy. What can you do? You need a Trump moment, actually. You need someone in power who's willing to just abolish the lot of them. I would get rid of the College of Policing for the first, and I would replace them with an equivalent that actually knows what it's supposed to be doing.
Okay. I'm thinking now we need to have a big sticker that you can go and put on the books in the bookshops, which is a very Brexity book.
Well, it's a little bit Brexity because, I was one of the only.
Work in its favour or against?
Well, that's the problem. Is that I think there were 5 comedians who were openly pro-Brexit at the time of Brexit, and I was one of them. And that's why all comedians hate me, even to this day. So I don't know.
Jimmy Tarbuck and,
I never met Jimmy Tarbuck.
Just joking.
No.
Right, let's go out. There's somebody right at the back to your left.
Hello, my name's Maeve. I'm 22, so potentially one of the younger people here. I've obviously yet to read your book, but I just wanted to know what you think about the state of universities and the role of both students and academics in, I suppose, toppling the woke ideology. I've just graduated from a degree at Bristol, and it's definitely still very much alive and kicking there. And I will say that I think academics are just as much, if not more, to blame than the students themselves when it comes to cultivating this whole idea that being kind should be championed above all else. And I would say that I think it's most sinister that this stuff's championed at universities, because they're obviously places where free speech should absolutely rule and no question should be offensive, let alone any kind of debate. So what do you think universities need to do to rid themselves of this ideology?
Are the students... Yeah. Are the students, are your peers of a mind with you, or do they go along with what the academics say?
So, funnily enough, it really varies. I think what the sad thing is less that people, don't agree with me. It's more that I know people do agree with me but say nothing. So it's not so much that they're disengaged or that they're, totally on the other side of things. If I'm honest, woke students, for a lot of them, I do believe it will be a phase. And as you mentioned, when they live a bit of real life, hopefully they'll sort of wake up to certain things. For me, the more sinister element is the fact that I know people think things and agree things, and they're literally coming up to me as somebody who's more openly holding a certain views, especially gender critical ones, and they'll be like, thanks so much for saying what you're saying, I really agree with you. But these conversations are literally whispered. So I think that's the problem. It's less so that students disagree, it's more so that if they are willing to dissent, so to speak, they're afraid to say so.
So that's the story of the culture war, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And if you go back to the Gulag Archipelago, there's a moment in Solzhenitsyn's book about the gulags in the Soviet regime where he mentions seeing someone dragged away through the village, and he says, it's like a thought experiment. He says, what if we'd have just shouted out, no? What if we weren't scared? What if we'd all done it? None of this would have happened. And I just think that's often the case. I think it's certainly the case with the woke. They never had the support. I mean, I mentioned that earlier. If everyone stood up, if everyone had said, no, human beings can't change sex. No, you can't give drugs to that child because he's a bit effeminate. No, you know what I mean? If we'd have just done it, no, we're not systemically racist and all the rest of it, but we didn't do it. We were basically pretty cowardly for good reason, because it's a scary situation. But yeah, it's a really interesting point mentioned about the academics. I think that's it. I think a lot of people over-blame the young. Whenever I've spoken on university campuses, I've had the reverse experience. And younger people they might disagree with me on a lot, but they're really open to the challenge and they really want to talk about it. When I did a talk at Gonville and Keyes in Cambridge, so many of them wanted to go and have a drink afterwards and discuss and disagree in a really healthy way, you know? And that was the week after Helen Joyce had appeared at the same college. She got protesters banging drums and one of the kids told me that they had to sneak in because they didn't want to be seen by some of their peers. It was so frightening and scary. But I've always been impressed by the students I've met. And it might be that that's a kind of self-selecting thing, the kind of students who would come to my event. Okay, I get that. But I'll give you another example. When I did a talk at Aberystwyth, it was the International Politics Department, which is apparently quite a prestigious department there at Aberystwyth. It was the kids that came along and wanted to have the discussion. The department boycotted the event, and they sent out an email to all the students saying, this event does not fall in line with our values. And one of the students showed me a copy of the email, which I duly quoted. So, but it's interesting, isn't it, that it is often the students. Often, I think my generation were, if anything, more zealous. And I think, particularly in academia, particularly there, and all of the studies show us how it's become a kind of monoculture, politically speaking, within academia. And so many academics think that their role is activists. Helen Pluckrose writes about this in her book, Cynical Theories, about the way in which the postmodernist theorists used to very fancifully toy with ideas and concepts, but they weren't talking about a cultural revolution to impose them until around 1989, and she calls it the applied turn. She wrote this book with James Lindsay, by the way, The Applied Turn, where actually it became about praxis. It became about actually enforcing these ideas and using the universities as a kind of conduit for the imposition of this ideology. And I think too many academics or activists, the rows I've had online, when I'm really, if I'm trolled by someone who's really childish and is saying all sorts of terrible things, 9 times out of 10, they've got PhD written in their bio. Like you can almost, it's so funny. Like you can straight away tell there's something about academia that fosters. Maybe it's the ivory tower thing. Maybe it's just being shielded from it in this way, only ever talking to like-minded people. But when they detect someone who's a dissenter, they are like children. And aren't they meant to be some of the most intelligent people?
Often they say they're dads as well, don't they?
What does that mean?
Well, no, they are dads.
Oh, you mean actual fathers?
Yeah, they say in their bios they're kind of these kind of men who are obviously trying to prove how woke they are, and they'll sort of say how much they love their kids.
I always mistrust. Or when they say anti-fascist, I'm like, well, what else would you be? Like that is my default expectation.
Right. Let's do some quick. Can we do some quick ones now, and quick answers and quick questions? So there's a chap with a tan-coloured T-shirt on with a wristwatch on his arm.
Craig, falling over here. Good evening, Andrew. Firstly, I hope you've got a couple of copies of your book here, because I need something to read on the train home. And
there's a bookseller, and I'll be signing them.
Perfect.
Yes.
There's room on my bookshelf next to Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, and Kathleen Stock for you, so you'll be in good company. It's been interesting listening to you, and It seems to me, from some of the things that you've been saying and some things that I've been reading, that one of the things that has been empowering woke and the trans ideology and the Islamophobia ideology, etc., has been the mistake that was made many years ago of putting it into law that hurting people's feelings or causing distress to them is now an offence. I was wondering if you, and maybe His Lordship sitting at the front there, have any ideas about how we can get this rotten legislation out and go back to the good old days of common sense and, sorry, but if your feelings have been hurt, sticks and stones, etc.
Okay,
and
thank you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm relieved that we have people like Toby and Claire Fox in the House of Lords making the case. Well, that's a big start. That's going to make a big difference. Because I would have loved to have seen parliamentarians standing up and saying, let's repeal the Communications Act 2003. Why has that never even been raised? It's not been mooted, as far as I'm aware. I mean, Toby, I might have got that wrong, but I haven't heard any politician say that. Right, so that is a clause, subset 127 of the Communications Act 2003, which says that any communication online that is deemed grossly offensive is against the law. Well, what does that mean? No one can agree on what that means. You can't possibly quantify that or give any sensible definition of that. It's equivalent to when the Irish tried to put through their hate speech bill last year, and in the draft legislation, in the wording, it actually said hatred means hatred. So they had a completely circular definition, which no one would ever be able to define. Well, how convenient for any future tyrannical government to have such nebulous legislation on the statute books. So I think we need politicians to have the guts, because I guess they think that if they, I mean, I don't want to do too much mind reading, but if you stand up and say, I think we should repeal hate speech laws, people might say, well, you're for hate, are you? You want racists to be able to say whatever they want. Actually, I do want racists to be able to say whatever they want. That doesn't mean I'm a racist or I support racism. It means that I value the principle of free speech above a few idiots wanting to say their horrible things, which I think is the more important principle. It's all, and it comes back to the point that I got very angry about earlier, about political will. Where are they? Where are the politicians saying, let's just scrap it? Let's just get rid of Section 127 of the Communications Act. Get rid of it. Or the element of the Public Order Act that has a similar effect. I'm not hearing it. And I don't know what that is. Is it, I don't know, do you think it's self-preservation is it because they're not, they're I don't know, self-serving? Is that what it is? Is it careerism? I don't know, but that's I think the answer, because we need more voices like Toby's in Parliament, basically.
In a way, nobody's making the boldest arguments for scrapping. I mean, it's difficult to undo legislation. People are much more comfortable arguing for new legislation rather than undoing existing one.
There's a way to do it, by the way, of being clear, of saying, I deeply oppose, offensive language for its own sake or demeaning or whatever, because, as I've said, we don't want to live in that kind of society. But we do want to live in the society where people can behave like that if they see fit. I mean, because it always comes down to a simple question with me, What is more of a threat to us as a society? Is it that a few idiots are going to want to try and rile up problems or stir up hate, that's the phrase they use, or that we empower the state to control speech? I just don't think anyone who knows a smidgen about history can come down on one side and not the other. I think it's so clear. How do we get, so I don't know, that's a good question. How do we get the politicians to have the guts to say it? Part of the other problem is I think they've all bought into the idea that speech online creates real world harm. That's a major problem. We know it's not true. Like, we just know from over 6 decades of media effects theories, we know that the direct effect model is not a thing. People don't read something in the media and act on cue as a result of it. That's not a thing. So why do we behave as though it is? Why do we behave as though Lucy Connolly's tweet could have in any way incited violence? It wasn't possible. She doesn't have any clout. She has no influence. Anyone reading that who then goes out and burns down a hotel, they're responsible for burning down the hotel, and they will have made that choice. They're not robots that just read a thing and go. It's the same attitude that said that people voted Brexit because a Russian bot told them to. That's not how human beings are. And we know it from the research. That's what really galls me about this. It's not even up for debate anymore. So, I think when it comes to that, for instance, the Lucy Connolly, I've argued again and again, we need the equivalent of the Brandenburg test in the UK. The Brandenburg test is a US test for incitement to violence that was based on a Supreme Court ruling about Clarence Brandenburg, KKK leader, who was, and following that prosecution, the threshold for incitement to violence has to be that it is intended to incite violence, that it is likely to incite violence, and that such violence would be imminent. And in the Lucy Connolly case, none of that is there. So it is an absolute madness that someone who writes something horrible in a rash moment and deletes it within a few hours is sentenced to 31 months in prison, when someone who actually goes and smashes up a mosque as part of a mob gets 28 months in prison. So they are so obsessed with this idea that words and violence are the same thing, that words are worse than violence, that they think it's okay that someone talking about violence should be punished harsher than someone actually doing it. If you put it in those terms, it's indefensible, isn't it?
Thank you. Right. Vinay, there's a chap over here who's had his hand up all the way through. Can you make it fairly brief? Thank you.
Thank you. Really good evening. Really informative. I'm here as a former police officer, as my colleague here. Literally 30 minutes before this event tonight, we detained a street robber, literally 200 yards from here. And my view, what my question is to you is, what do you think of two-tier policing? We think it's very evident. We think it's there and it's realistic. But we hear from various parts of the government, it's non-existent. What's your thoughts?
Well, it's definitely there. And the problem is that throughout the woke era, we've been gaslit. We've been told to believe things that are not true. And we've been told that the things that are true aren't true. So we're sort of used to it by now, the continual denial of what we can all see before our eyes. It's so common. So we now just have to, I suppose when it comes to the question of two-tier policing, we have to build a kind of dossier of the evidence, don't we? I think. We have had whistleblowers who have come forward and expressed, well, given us evidence that people have been instructed to treat people differently. But you can look at, you can actually, I'm sure we could quantify this with some kind of study, but we know that, for instance, we've seen the slew of death threats and rape threats that women get every day from trans rights activists, which are never investigated. They're just ignored. There's so much evidence of that. And yet, misgendering can get a knock on the door, right? Kelly J. Keane was visited by police, and they actually said to her, "You were being untoward about paedophiles." That sounds like I've made that up. It's real. And that's not the only police visit she had. So I'm just, I did a thread about all the times that police have investigated or arrested or even prosecuted people for speech, and it went on and on and on. And I think when people saw it, they couldn't quite believe it. They thought I'd made a lot of it up, but it was all real. And I think when you start building, the reason I did that is I wanted to be able to show, I wanted to be able to say, look, stop denying it. There's all of this. Explain all of this. Maybe we can do the same with two-tier policing. Maybe someone could fund some kind of study into, I don't know how, there'd be a lot of freedom of information requests, wouldn't there? You'd have to find out a lot about who has complained about the death and rape threats from trans activists, how many of them have been acted upon, how many of them have been fudged, how many misgendering cases, etc. It's a big, long operation. But maybe that's what we have to do, just to say, look, we've got the proof now. You can't keep gaslighting us like this when we can all see it. I think that's probably the only answer, right?
And the other thing you could do is buy one of our new T-shirts or sweatshirts or hoodies that says, "Police our streets, not our tweets." And then maybe arrest some robbers as you're out and about. Citizens arrest. Final question. I'm not going to get to everybody today, I'm afraid. I normally try to, but there's no way we're going to.
Super. My name is Michelle Shipworth. Full disclosure, I'm an academic. Should you know...
I wasn't talking about you.
Fair enough. So if the College of Policing should be just put out to pasture, should universities be saved? If so, how?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So I had an argument with Peter Boghossian about this, who's an academic in America. So I think his view is that they should just be destroyed. He says that he's razed to the ground in a really theatrical way. I don't think so. I come down on Helen Pluckrose's side on that. We've put so much into them. Like Oxford is 1,000 years old. I mean, it's worth holding on to, isn't it? It's weird that the most elite institutions are the most captured. And so it's so hard. And I don't think we should just completely throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think we can still reform them, maybe. I don't know how. But I also support the idea of creating new institutions. Maybe that's how, actually. You know, I know University of Austin in Texas has had some problems, but they're starting something up. Ralston College in Savannah is starting something up. The Peterson Academy, which is an online thing that Jordan Peterson set up. I did a series of lectures for that on Shakespeare's tragedies. I'm not plugging it, I'm just saying. I really support that idea. Because if you have competition, because people have flocked to these, by the way. Peterson Academy has got over 40,000 subscribers already. Ralston College is oversubscribed. Like, I think a lot of young people, it's what Maeve was saying earlier, a lot of young people are craving not to be spoon-fed ideology. They want to actually think, because that talent hasn't gone away. That's sort of innate in humankind. So I think students are desperate for a proper classical education where they're encouraged to think for themselves, but they're also trained in the rigors of the subject. Like, I think they really want it. And I think maybe if we have enough alternative institutions that offer that, and they become the go-to places, which is, again, such a long process, maybe those other institutions might think, maybe we have to adapt and change. Or maybe it's just the case that the woke ideology will die off in the gradual way I'm describing, and it simply will quite naturally fall out of universities. I don't know. Or maybe it's to do with that thing I was talking about, political will. Maybe you need that kind of will amongst vice-chancellors and those sorts of peoples. Like, was it Chicago University that put out the statement about free speech, saying, you know, we're not going to allow you to bully other students off campus, you know, taking a firm line. When students break the law, when they occupy and prevent other students from going to lectures, boot them out, right? Because that's not a free speech issue. You've signed up to behave in a certain way and not to break the law. I hate it when people say, well, you're supposed to be a free speech advocate, but I can't smash this guy over the head with a hammer, or whatever it might be. You know, the laws are not the same. So I think that, so there's various options there. And the reason I'm giving various options is because I don't know, but I do balk at the idea of just going full nuclear. I do. I think you need to, go nuclear on the College of Policing and go nuclear on the worst quangos.
Taser the universities.
Yeah, but a bit of tasering. Yeah. Not a purge, but, you know, a tasering. Yeah.
A dark threat, perhaps.
Yeah, be a bit menacing. I don't know. Who knows?
Great. Well, we're going to wind up there. Unfortunately, I know there's people who didn't get to ask their questions, but you have got a book through which you can pursue all of Andrew's thinking, and then other books as well that he's written that you can also find out what he thinks. So I don't feel too guilty about denying you the chance to ask questions. You can also, obviously, you should buy your book tonight from Callum in the corner here. We've got a brilliant bookstall, and then Andrew will sign it for you, time allowing. And if you're online, you can also go and buy the book wherever you wish to buy it from. We're not going to suggest any particular retailer at the moment, because I think Primrose Hill Books may have run out of signed copies now, or about to run out. But they're providing books tonight, and you can get them signed in person. So can we have a massive round of applause for Andrew? And if we all had glasses in our hands, we could raise them to Andrew, but we don't. So you need to go off and get another glass of wine or bottle of beer. And there will be more provided for a short while, I think, until we reach our limit, basically. And then it's a cash bar. But you're welcome to stay till about 10-ish, I think, or probably a bit later. And meet everybody else in the room. Thank you very much for coming.